Hey guys, tonight we will peel back the mysterious curtain on the woman who defied and survived one of history's most terrifying kings, Henry VIII of England. Imagine this. You are a young girl, raised in strict seclusion, having never seen the outside world. Suddenly, a portrait of you is sent to the powerful, corpulent king, famous for having twice beheaded his former wives. He is immediately captivated. The marriage is set, but right at the first meeting, everything collapses. You are rejected. You realize that your deadly charm is actually your life-saving ticket. This is not just a story about a short, annulled marriage. This is the dramatic journey of Anne of Cleves, the one considered the unluckiest wife for being scorned, yet the luckiest for cleverly turning rejection into wealth, freedom, and outliving all of Henry's other wives. How did she do it? By accepting her dismissal, Anne bought herself an independent status, becoming the king's beloved sister, and silently watching the tragedies that befell the women who replaced her. She was a master of survival, an intelligent woman who saw the danger, accepted stepping aside to gain a peaceful life. She truly is a silent hero of the turbulent Tudor era. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, let me know where you are relaxing and what your current local time is. I hope your night is quiet and peaceful. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Anne of Cleves was born on the 22nd of September, 1515, in Dusseldorf, the ducal seat of her father John, Duke of Cleves, and her mother, Maria of Jülich-Bergmark. She was the second of 4 children, placed between an older sister named Sibyl, a younger sister named Amalia, and an elder brother, William, who would one day inherit their father's titles. Sibyl, the eldest, was married at the tender age of 12 to John Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, in a political arrangement that bound the Cleves family to one of the most powerful Protestant houses in the Holy Roman Empire. Amalia, the youngest, would remain unmarried all her life, while William, after their father's death, would rule over Cleves with a seriousness that would later shape the destiny of his sisters. Anne's childhood unfolded within the thick walls of Berg Castle at Singen, a structure that, by the early 16th century, had long ceased to be a fortress of war, and had become instead a palace of comfort. The halls of Berg were filled with tapestries, polished wood, and the soft hum of servants. Yet within that gentility, Anne's upbringing was disciplined rather than indulgent. Though her surroundings spoke of wealth, her education was narrow by the standards of noble women elsewhere in Europe. She learned to read and write in her native German, and her letters later in life reveal a clear but unadorned hand. Her accomplishments were domestic rather than intellectual: embroidery, needlework, and the creation of elaborate woven hangings that adorned both chapel and hall. In those delicate crafts, she found calm and purpose, for Anne's world was one of duty and quiet repetition, not debate or discourse. The spiritual atmosphere of the household was divided. Her father, Duke John, was sympathetic to Martin Luther's reforms and read the writings of Erasmus with a scholar's curiosity. Her mother, Duchess Maria, remained a devout Catholic who clung to the Latin rites of her youth. Between them, Anne grew up in a household where 2 faiths coexisted in uneasy harmony, a reflection perhaps of the Europe that surrounded them, poised uneasily between old belief and new. Her education, therefore, was not one of philosophy, but of piety, prayers, catechisms, and the decorum expected of a future bride, whose destiny would be woven through treaties and alliances rather than affection. When Anne was only 11 years old, in the year 1527, her father arranged a betrothal for her to Francis, the 9-year-old heir of the Duke of Lorraine. It was a match meant to strengthen the political wall of small Protestant and reform-minded states against the growing might of the Habsburgs. The engagement, however, was more theory than promise. Both children were far too young, and as the years passed, the political winds shifted. By 1535, the arrangement was quietly dissolved. Yet the ghost of that childhood contract would return years later to play an unexpected role in Anne's fate. For when King Henry VIII of England sought to annul his own marriage to her, he would point to that forgotten pre-contract as proof that their union had never been valid in the eyes of God. As the decade of the 1530s drew to a close, the world that Anne would soon enter was already trembling. Across the Channel, In England, King Henry had buried his third wife, Jane Seymour, the only one to give him a living son. Jane died in October of 1537, after bringing into the world the fragile infant Prince Edward. The court was plunged into mourning that lasted until the following spring. Henry, aging and often ill, wore his grief like armour, and yet, behind the veil of sorrow, his counsellors whispered of the need for another queen, for alliances, for the securing of the young Tudor dynasty. Henry hesitated. He was both weary of marriage and terrified of loneliness. Meanwhile in Rome, the Pope, enraged by the execution of the English nobles Henry Courtenay and Henry Pole, Lord Montague renewed his excommunication of the English king. Isolated from Catholic Europe, Henry's government now looked northward, toward the Protestant states of the empire, for friendship and security. Cleves, with its moderate Lutheran leanings and its position between France and the Habsburg lands, seemed a natural choice. And so, almost without her knowing it, the quiet young woman who embroidered by the fire at Berg Castle began to move like a piece on a great chessboard toward a destiny written by kings and ministers. In her calm provincial world, Anne could not have imagined that her name would soon be spoken in the same breath as that of Henry VIII, the monarch whose wives had already become the stuff of tragedy and legend. Her life until then had been uneventful, even serene, a world of hymns, sewing, and winter evenings by the Rhine. Yet somewhere beyond those peaceful walls, history was already unfolding, and the girl from Cleves, simple, pious, and unassuming, was about to be drawn into one of the strangest and most poignant stories of the Tudor age. In the year 1539, two of King Henry's Protestant-leaning envoys, Nicholas Wotton and Robert Barnes, were sent to Dusseldorf to negotiate a possible marriage between their sovereign and one of the daughters of the late Duke of Cleves. John, Duke of Cleves, had died on the 6th of February that same year, leaving the matter in the hands of his son and successor, William, a young man of stern principle and even sterner views on female propriety. When the English ambassadors arrived, they found the household governed by an austerity that startled them. The two eligible sisters, Anne and Amalia, were brought before them fully cloaked in heavy garments, their faces veiled, their figures completely concealed. The ambassadors, uncertain and anxious, attempted to explain that their king wished to know what the ladies looked like. Duke William's reply was sharp and indignant. "Would you have them appear naked before you?" To William, this request was immodest, and he saw no reason to indulge the curiosity of a foreign monarch whose reputation for chasing beauty across altars was infamous. Henry VIII's history wives taken and discarded, one even executed, was well known across Europe, and William feared that his sister might one day share that fate. Still, political necessity pressed upon both sides. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the architect of this alliance, laboured tirelessly to persuade the English court that the match would serve the nation well. Cleves, standing between France and the Empire, was a valuable Protestant ally. To sweeten the prospect, Cromwell spoke glowingly of Anne's modesty, virtue, and gentleness qualities that, he insisted, shone brighter than mere beauty. To ease Henry's doubts, Cromwell called upon the king's favourite artist, Hans Holbein the Younger, to paint portraits of the Cleves sisters. Yet even this required William's permission, and that was not easily granted. He delayed for weeks, uneasy at the idea of his sisters being displayed for the judgment of a distant king. When at last he consented, Holbein set to work with the careful eye of a court painter who knew how perilous a brushstroke could be. He portrayed Anne in a frontal pose, a composition rare for the time, her hands folded gracefully, her expression calm and composed. The straight-on angle softened the length of her nose and gave her face a youthful sweetness. Her gown, richly jewelled, and her elaborate headdress signified her noble rank without ostentation. It was an image of dignity, restraint, and quiet grace, the kind of beauty that did not challenge a man's pride. When the portrait reached England, Henry was captivated. He studied it with delight, remarking upon her serene countenance and gentle eyes. To Cromwell's immense relief, the king declared himself satisfied. Anne, he said, was the woman he desired. Henry's vanity, fed by the notion that this foreign princess might admire him as a powerful sovereign, outweighed all hesitation. But before the formal betrothal could be completed, one obstacle remained. Duke William recalled the childhood betrothal once arranged between Anne and Francis of Lorraine. If any binding contract still existed, it would make a new marriage unlawful. Thus, inquiries were sent to the ecclesiastical courts of both England and Cleves. After careful review, both sides confirmed that no valid pre-contract could be found. The earlier arrangement had been nothing more than a diplomatic gesture between children. With that barrier removed, the path to marriage was clear. On the 4th of September, 1539, the marriage treaty between King Henry VIII of England and Lady Anne of Cleves was formally signed. The agreement was generous. Should Anne indeed be as lovely as her reputation suggested, Henry promised to marry her without demanding a dowry, an extraordinary offer from a king often preoccupied with wealth. For the impoverished William, it was an arrangement impossible to refuse. So the treaty was sealed, and the machinery of state began to turn. Letters crossed the channel, preparations were made, and the artist's portrait became the symbol of a union that promised peace, alliance, and prosperity. Yet within that still image, the demure smile, the folded hands, the serenity of her gaze lay the seed of a terrible misunderstanding. For Henry's desire was built not upon the woman herself, but upon the painted likeness that now hung before him. In the quiet halls of Berg Castle, Anne continued her life of prayers and domestic order, unaware that the ink drying on a royal parchment in faraway London had already changed her fate. The wheel of history, once set in motion, would carry her from the modest calm of Cleves to the uneasy splendour of the English court toward a meeting that would shake her world, and his, beyond repair. In early November of 1539, Anne of Cleves began the long journey that would take her from the quiet security of her homeland to the unpredictable court of England. She had never travelled by sea, and so it was decided that she should go by land through the Low Countries and then across the Channel from Calais. Her progress was slow, hindered by winter weather and the elaborate ceremonies that accompanied her at every stop. After weeks of travel, she reached Calais on the 11th of December. From there, her entourage crossed the Channel safely, and she set foot on English soil on the 27th of December. 2 days later, on the 29th, she rode toward Canterbury through bitter winds and icy rain. By New Year's Eve, she rested within the walls of Rochester Abbey, unaware that her first encounter with the king, an encounter that would decide the course of her life, was only hours away. The English court was alive with excitement. Nobles and ladies competed for the honour of serving in the new queen's household. Reports from those who met Anne along the way described her as cheerful, courteous, and eager to please. She spoke only German, but was determined to learn English quickly. Her demeanour, everyone agreed, was gentle and good-natured. No one spoke ill of her appearance. On the contrary, she was praised as pleasant, kind, and merry. For the first time in years, England seemed ready to welcome a new queen. But destiny often chooses strange moments to reveal itself. On the morning of the 1st of January, 1540, King Henry VIII, unable to restrain his curiosity, decided to visit his bride in secret. It was a practice born of old romantic custom, the notion that the bride should be able to see through disguise and recognize her true love. Henry dressed himself in a cloak of plain cloth and rode to Rochester, calling himself a simple messenger of the king. Anne was seated by a window, watching a bear-baiting match in the courtyard below, when the door to her chamber opened and a broad, ruddy-faced man strode in unannounced. He carried a gift from the king, and before she could rise or understand who he was, he seized her in his arms and kissed her. Anne, startled and frightened, for she did not yet understand a word of English, recoiled and turned away, trembling. To her, it was an intrusion, even an assault. She had been raised to strict modesty, and the man before her seemed no more than a rough peasant. Henry stepped back, shocked by her reaction. He left the room in a storm of wounded pride, only to return minutes later dressed in royal splendour. The truth dawned on Anne, and she fell to her knees in embarrassment. The king lifted her up and kissed her once more, in the English fashion. They dined together that evening, speaking through interpreters. The conversation was halting, awkward, filled with polite smiles and long silences. Yet for Henry, the damage was done. His vanity, so carefully fed by flattery, had been wounded beyond repair. When the king returned to his courtiers, his face was dark with displeasure. "I like her not," he said coldly, words that would echo through history. From that moment, no one around him dared to contradict his opinion. Ministers, courtiers, and ladies all agreed that the Lady Anne was not as beautiful as the portrait had promised. The tide of admiration turned overnight. Henry began at once to look for ways to escape the marriage. He questioned the legality of her previous betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine's son, and demanded that Anne swear she was free from any prior contract. She did so without hesitation, calmly and obediently, her composure only deepening his frustration. But no fault could be found, and the alliance with Cleves was too valuable to risk. The king was trapped by his own politics. Thus, on the 6th of January, 1540, the marriage took place at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer officiated. Anne wore a gown of rich cloth of gold, her demeanour solemn and dignified. Henry, pale and unsmiling, went through the motions. By nightfall, England had a new queen, one her husband already despised. The next morning, Henry confided to his physicians and counsellors that the marriage had not been consummated. He complained that the queen had an unpleasant odour, that her breasts were slack, that he found her unappealing. To excuse himself, he added that he had suffered 2 nocturnal emissions. Proof, he said, that his own vigour was unimpaired. Gossip spread quickly through the court. In her chambers, Anne remained composed. When her English ladies asked whether the marriage had been consummated, she answered with quiet candour. "Every night," she said, "the king kisses me, takes me by the hand and says, 'Good night, sweetheart.' In the morning he kisses me again and says, 'Farewell, darling.' Beyond that, nothing." Anne was no fool. Though her formal education had been modest, she understood perfectly what was meant by marriage and by silence. She knew that the king had not touched her, and that her only safety lay in never making him feel humiliated. So she smiled, obeyed, and waited, not yet knowing that her patience would one day save her life. On the 24th of June, 1540, Queen Anne of Cleves was quietly ordered to leave the royal court and retire to Richmond Palace. The reason given was a plague within the city, but everyone understood the true meaning. Whenever King Henry wished to separate himself from a wife, this was how it began: distance first, and then the undoing. Around the same time, the king was seen gliding down the River Thames in his royal barge toward Lambeth, where a young woman named Catherine Howard, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, was staying. To those who watched, the pattern was unmistakable. The king's heart, if it could be called that, was moving again, and Anne's brief reign as Queen of England was nearing its end. At Richmond, Anne maintained her usual calm. She had learned by now that fear was useless in the face of Henry's will. Yet in the deep hours of the night on the 6th of July, she was startled awake by a sudden knocking at her chamber door. Royal commissioners demanded to see her on a matter of great importance. Startled and half asleep, Anne fainted. The memory of what had happened to the king's previous wives, the accusations, the sham trials, the blood on the scaffold, must have flooded her mind. When she awoke, pale and trembling, the envoys reassured her that no harm was intended. The king, they said, wished only to examine the legality of their marriage, having discovered evidence of a possible pre-contract with the Duke of Lorraine's son from her childhood. Anne understood perfectly. Henry wanted an escape, and he would find one, whether by law or by decree. Her only choice was to turn this humiliation into freedom. So she played her part with flawless grace, sighing at her misfortune, lamenting the loss of such a most excellent prince, but conceding that if their marriage was not valid in God's eyes, she could not, in good conscience, oppose his will. Within days, she sent a formal letter agreeing to the dissolution of the marriage. The rewards she received were astonishing. In exchange for her compliance, Henry granted her an annual income of approximately £4,000, a princely sum by any standard, along with several grand estates. The manors of Bletchingley and Richmond, and Hever Castle, once the home of Anne Boleyn. She was also given fine jewels, gold plate, and a new title, the King's beloved sister. In courtly rank, she stood above all women in England, except the future Queen and Henry's 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Henry, perhaps out of guilt or perhaps vanity, went even further. To silence gossip about his supposed impotence, he publicly declared that Anne remained a virgin and was free to marry again if she wished. In doing so, he contradicted his own earlier claims that she had not pleased him as a woman. Yet no one dared to note the inconsistency. Anne accepted all of it with her characteristic composure, curtsying gracefully before the man who had cast her aside. On the 9th of July, 1540, The clerical court declared the marriage null and void. Anne signed the document in Henry's presence, her hand steady, her face serene. It was over the shortest and least violent of the king's 6 marriages. In the weeks that followed, she wrote to her brother, Duke William, explaining the situation. She told him she would not return to Cleves, since the lands and titles she now held would remain hers only if she stayed in England. "I like it here," she added, with quiet simplicity. William's reply was restrained. Publicly, he announced that he was glad my sister has fared no worse. Privately, he was disgusted by Henry's behaviour and feared for Anne's safety in the years to come, but he need not have worried. For once, the wheel of fortune turned gently. Anne settled into her new life with surprising ease. She rode and hunted, hosted small banquets, and delighted in fine clothes and jewels. She took pleasure in the freedom that came with wealth and solitude, a rare gift for any woman of her time. Courtiers who visited her estates remarked upon her good humour and generosity. She was often invited back to court, where she was received with warmth and ceremony. In a strange twist of fate, Anne became a trusted friend to the very man who had rejected her. Henry found in her a calmness that soothed his temper, and he continued to send her gifts and letters, even as he prepared to wed Catherine Howard. From disgrace, Anne had fashioned peace. From rejection, she had drawn security. In a court defined by peril and ambition, she alone had learned the art of survival by smiling, by yielding, and by knowing when to let go. Anne of Cleves soon became close to the king's 2 daughters, Princess Mary, solemn and devout, and the younger Princess Elizabeth, bright and eager but often overlooked beside her half-brother, Prince Edward. Of the 2, it was Elizabeth whom Anne especially adored. The child was barely 7 when she first began visiting Richmond Palace, where Anne resided. The girl's laughter filled the quiet corridors, and Anne, unable to have children of her own, welcomed her with a tenderness that was almost maternal. The courtiers began to call Anne the little princess's aunt, and before long, Elizabeth herself used the title affectionately. Their bond would last through the shifting storms of Tudor politics, a friendship built not on blood, but on understanding. While Anne's days were peaceful, the man who had engineered her marriage met a violent end. Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's most trusted minister, became the scapegoat for the Cleves disaster. On the 28th of July, 1540, he was led to Tower Hill and beheaded. The executioner's first stroke failed, and a second was needed to sever his head completely. The same day, Henry married Catherine Howard, the young niece of the Duke of Norfolk. Cromwell's fall had been swift, and Anne, from her quiet household, must have watched with the calm detachment of someone who had learned that survival in Henry's England depended on silence. Less than 2 years later, on the 13th of February, 1542, Catherine Howard followed Anne Boleyn to the scaffold. Her execution reopened old discussions at court. Some of Henry's advisers, and even Duke William of Cleves, quietly suggested that the king might take back his former wife. The idea had logic, it pleased the people, soothed international alliances, and offered Henry a wife of proven obedience. But when the proposal reached the king, he dismissed it instantly. Perhaps Anne, in her heart, was relieved. Publicly, she played her role with clever grace. She sighed in mock regret that the king had rejected her once more, which flattered his vanity enough for him to assure her that, though she would never again be his wife, she would forever remain the king's beloved sister. When Henry took his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, in July of 1543, Anne reacted with her usual dry wit. Upon hearing the news, she reportedly remarked, "Madame Parr hath taken a great burden upon herself. It was not spite, only clear-sighted wisdom." Anne knew too well what it meant to bear the weight of Henry's affection. The years that followed were calm. When Henry died on the 28th of January, 1547, Anne's right to live in the royal houses of Bletchingley and Richmond was revoked by the Regency Council of Edward VI. She withdrew to Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn, where she lived quietly and maintained a steady correspondence with court officials about her finances. Many of her letters were addressed to Thomas Cawarden, the master of the revels, who managed her accounts. She was persistent but never impolite, asking only for what was owed to her by law. Under the reign of Queen Mary I, Anne returned briefly to public life. On the 4th of August, 1553, she wrote to congratulate the Queen on her marriage to Philip of Spain. 2 months later, on the 28th of September, she appeared in London for Mary's coronation. Riding in a ceremonial litter behind the Queen, she occupied a position of honour, a gesture of affection from the new monarch, and a public reminder of Anne's unique place in the Tudor family. It would be her last public appearance. England had by then returned to the Roman faith, and Anne, whose family background combined both Lutheran and Catholic influences, adapted easily. She attended Mass and prayed in Latin once more, finding no contradiction in her conscience. Yet her life at court was drawing to an end. After Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, a Protestant uprising against Mary's marriage to Philip, suspicion briefly fell upon many of the Queen's acquaintances. Whispers suggested that Anne had written to her brother in Cleves on behalf of the young Princess Elizabeth, perhaps to protect her from danger. Whether true or not, the rumour was enough. Anne was discreetly advised to remain at her country estates, and she did. By 1557, her health had begun to fail. Modern historians believe she may have suffered from cancer. Queen Mary allowed her to move to Chelsea Old Manor, a quieter residence near the river. There, Anne prepared for death with the same calm that had defined her life. She wrote her will carefully, ensuring that each of her servants, more than 50 in total, received money, jewels, or clothing. She requested that the rents from her lands be used to settle her debts, and that one of her maids might be taken into the service of Princess Elizabeth. On the 16th of July, 1557, Anne of Cleves died peacefully in her sleep. She was 41 years old, and the last surviving wife of Henry VIII. Queen Mary, who had come to love her as a friend, ordered a royal funeral at Westminster Abbey. Anne's coffin, covered in cloth of gold, was borne through the abbey with full Catholic rites. Plans were made for an elaborate monument, but they were never completed, even during the reign of King James I. For centuries, her resting place was marked only by the initials A.C., until a small plaque was added in 1970. History would remember her as the rejected wife, the woman Henry did not want. Yet the truth is gentler. Anne of Cleves was the most fortunate of them all, the wife who lost a crown but gained her life. Calm, intelligent, and endlessly patient, she navigated the perils of a deadly court and emerged with peace, dignity, and the rare gift of freedom. When King Henry VIII first met Anne of Cleves, nothing unfolded as he had imagined. For most of his life, Henry had been surrounded by courtiers who told him what he wanted to hear, that he remained as handsome, virile, and magnetic as in his youth. His reflection in their flattery was one of eternal majesty. Yet on that cold day in late December, 1539, the mirror cracked. The king approached the meeting with the confidence of a man certain of his own allure, expecting that his new bride would fall instantly under his charm. What awaited him instead was a young woman from a very different world, a German duchess raised in piety and modesty, untouched by the performative flirtations of the English court. Anne knew little of English language or custom. To her, the idea of a disguised monarch bursting unannounced into a lady's chamber was unthinkable. When Henry, dressed in a rough cloak and calling himself a mere messenger, strode in and took her by surprise, she did not see a king in disguise. She saw a stranger. He seized her hand, drew her close, and kissed her before she could react. The act meant to be romantic was, to Anne, a shocking breach of propriety. She stiffened, turned away, and stood frozen, eyes downcast. In that single instant, the gulf between them became unbridgeable. Henry, embarrassed by her reaction, left the room in a fury. When he returned, now dressed in royal robes, he found Anne kneeling awkwardly, confusion written across her face. The courtly game of love in disguise, so familiar in England, was entirely foreign to her. Her innocence, her lack of artifice, the very traits Cromwell had praised now, offended the king's pride. The charm he had expected to inspire was nowhere to be found. That night, Henry's vanity bled into anger. His courtiers, ever alert to the temper of their sovereign, echoed his displeasure. "I like her not," the king declared bluntly. "She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported." His words spread through the palace like wildfire. To disagree was unthinkable, to agree was safe. And so, within hours, the same courtiers who had once praised Anne's sweetness began whispering that she was plain, dull, even coarse. Yet the political machinery that had brought her to England could not easily be undone. The alliance with Cleves was too valuable, too delicate to discard. Henry raged, but his counsellors insisted that the marriage must go forward. Thomas Cromwell, whose career now hung in the balance, reminded the king that to break the treaty would be to alienate Protestant allies and invite renewed hostility from the Catholic powers of Europe. Henry, cornered by his own diplomacy, relented. The wedding would proceed, but his heart was already elsewhere. On the 6th of January, 1540, the marriage ceremony took place at Greenwich Palace. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, performed the rites. Anne, dressed in cloth of gold embroidered with pearls, carried herself with quiet dignity. Henry, standing beside her, did not smile. Courtiers who witnessed the event later remarked on the tension in the air, as though all of England held its breath. The vows were spoken, the ring placed upon her finger, and the King of England unwillingly took his fourth wife. That night, the royal couple retired to their chamber. What passed, or rather, what did not pass between them, became the talk of Europe. The following morning, Henry confided to his physician that he could not perform the act. He complained that the Queen's body was unpleasing, that she exuded a strange odour, that her breasts were slack signs, he claimed, of a woman who was no maid. To defend his manhood, he added that he had suffered 2 emissions in the night, proof that his own powers were unimpaired. His excuses were repeated and embellished by those around him, until the entire court knew that the king had rejected his bride. Anne, meanwhile, said nothing in her defence. When her English ladies, curious and perhaps sympathetic, asked whether the marriage had been consummated, she answered simply, "Every night he kisses me, takes me by the hand and says, 'Good night, sweetheart.' In the morning he kisses me again and says, 'Farewell, darling.' Beyond that, nothing." Her words, spoken softly and without bitterness, revealed her intelligence. Anne understood far more than she was given credit for. She knew her position was precarious, and that any expression of resentment might cost her life. The Tudor court had little mercy for queens who displeased their husband, so she smiled when spoken to, bowed when required, and kept her silence. By the end of January, whispers had spread through London that the king sought to annul the marriage, but until a legal pretext could be found, Anne remained queen in name, a stranger in her own palace. Behind the walls of Greenwich, she moved with quiet composure, the embodiment of grace in the face of humiliation. Henry, bound by treaty but consumed by pride, could only wait for the moment when diplomacy would permit him to cast her aside. And so the days passed tense, empty, and silent like a candle burning slowly to its end. Anne of Cleves knew she was living upon the edge of a knife. She had crossed the sea into a foreign kingdom where she spoke little of the language, knew none of the customs, and found herself bound to a husband who regarded her with visible disdain. The court she had entered was a place of glittering danger, full of eyes, whispers, and betrayals disguised as courtesy. Around her moved those who had watched 2 queens rise and fall before her, their smiles concealing the memory of executioners and scaffoldings. Anne understood this world almost immediately. Beauty could not save a woman here, nor wit nor passion. Only composure could. And so, she made composure her shield. She adapted quickly to English life. Within weeks, she learned the rhythms of court ceremony, when to bow, when to smile, when to speak, and when to hold her tongue. She began to study the language, repeating English phrases until they sounded natural enough to pass. She adopted Henry's peculiar brand of religion, that uneasy mixture of Protestant reform and Catholic ritual that satisfied neither Rome nor Wittenberg. Her upbringing in Cleves had already taught her to live between 2 faiths, with a Lutheran father and a Catholic mother. Now that same ability to balance contradiction became her quiet salvation. Anne did not complain. She did not plead for affection or protest her innocence. When questioned about her married life, she answered with gentle humour, "Each night the king kisses me, takes me by the hand, and says, 'Good night, sweetheart.' Each morning he kisses me again and says, 'Farewell, darling.'" To the women of the Tudor court, the remark was both witty and tragic, a subtle acknowledgement that the marriage was no true marriage at all. Yet Anne never said a word that would humiliate her husband. She understood that Henry's pride was more dangerous than his anger. Where others might have despaired, Anne chose serenity. She rose early, attended prayers, and busied herself with embroidery, reading, and the management of her small household. She smiled when spoken to, curtsied with precision, and observed every ritual of the English court. Her stillness became her armor. In a palace where one wrong word could mean death, silence was not submission, it was survival. The courtiers began to notice something curious about the new queen. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, she did not argue. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she did not challenge. Unlike Jane Seymour, she did not beg for love or sympathy. She seemed instead untroubled calm, as still water beneath a winter sky. Even those who mocked her accent or her foreign manners found it difficult to despise her for long. Her patience disarmed malice. Henry himself could not remain wholly unmoved. At first he avoided her, dined apart, and refused to share her chamber. But over time, her gentleness softened his irritation. He saw that Anne bore him no resentment, that she sought neither favour nor confrontation. Her quiet acceptance reflected back at him in a way that unsettled him, for it robbed him of his usual sense of power. He could destroy a woman who fought him, but not one who forgave him before he struck. In the gossiping corners of the court, people began to speak of the Queen's dignity. They compared her to the unfortunate wives who had come before the passionate Anne Boleyn, whose sharp tongue had cost her head, the devout Catherine of Aragon, whose defiance had torn the kingdom in two. Anne of Cleves, by contrast, seemed untouchable in her meekness. She smiled even when others smirked. She attended feasts where the king refused to look at her, yet she never faltered in her grace. Behind that serenity, however, was a clear intelligence. Anne's restraint was not ignorance, but strategy. She had seen enough of life to know that protest would not win her Henry's heart. It would only hasten her ruin. By remaining pliant, she made herself harmless, and in Henry's world, harmless meant safe. Gradually, her composure became a kind of quiet strength. Those who served her began to respect her not for her beauty, but for her self-control. The English ladies who had once whispered about the dull German princess started to admire her kindness and fairness. Her household ran smoothly, her servants were well treated, and no scandal ever touched her name. In time, even Henry ceased to rage. Though he never loved her, he grew less inclined to humiliate her. Perhaps he recognized that Anne was not his enemy, only another casualty of his restless will. He spoke of her with indifference rather than hatred, and in the dangerous hierarchy of Henry's affection, that indifference was a kind of mercy. So Anne endured. She survived the cold silences, the gossiping courtiers, the distant husband. While others tried to charm or change the king, she did neither. She waited patient, quiet, and still knowing that storms pass faster when one does not fight the wind. And in that stillness, she began, slowly, to win the one thing no queen before her had ever gained in Henry's court: safety. On the 24th of June, 1540, King Henry VIII sent an official order that Queen Anne of Cleves should leave the royal court and take up residence at Richmond Palace. The reason was cloaked in formality. The plague has broken out in the city, the messengers said, but everyone at court understood what it truly meant. It was not disease that the king wished to avoid, but his wife. Across England, whispers spread like wind through the corridors of great houses. The king was preparing once again to set aside his queen. At the same time, talk of a young woman named Catherine Howard began to fill the air. She was youthful, lively, and part of the powerful Howard family. Henry, now approaching 50, was said to have been enchanted by her laughter, her beauty, her light step. Courtiers who once paid homage to Queen Anne began finding excuses to visit Lambeth, where Catherine was staying under the supervision of her relatives. When Henry was seen taking his royal barge down the Thames to Lambeth, his intentions became clear to all. Anne, though outwardly calm, must have understood that her position had become perilous. She had no child to secure her place, and no allies strong enough to challenge the king's will. Still, she conducted herself with grace, following the same path of patience that had so far preserved her life. But in the deep hours of the night on the 6th of July, 1540, that composure was tested. A group of commissioners, sent by the king himself, arrived at her residence and demanded to see her on a matter of urgent importance. Awakened abruptly, and seeing royal messengers at her door, Anne's blood must have run cold. She fainted outright, convinced that her time had come, that she would follow the path of Anne Boleyn to the Tower and the block. When she awoke, trembling, she found the men still there, their manner grave but not cruel. They reassured her that no harm was intended. The king, they said, had commanded them to speak with her about the legality of their marriage. It had come to his attention, they continued, that a prior pre-contract, a childhood betrothal to Francis, the son of the Duke of Lorraine, might render their union invalid in the eyes of both church and law. Anne immediately understood what this meant. The king was seeking a way out not in anger, but in pretense of virtue. The annulment would be framed as a discovery of legal impediment, not royal rejection. Her only choice was to play her part, and she did so flawlessly. She sighed, lamenting that she was about to lose the most noble and virtuous prince in Christendom, yet added softly that if the marriage was not lawful, she could not wish to offend God by maintaining it. Her performance was so convincing that even the commissioners later admitted they were moved by her composure. Within days, Anne wrote formally to the king, expressing her consent to the dissolution of their marriage. Her obedience pleased him immensely, and the rewards that followed were extraordinary. In exchange for her compliance, Henry granted her an annuity of £4,000 a fortune in Tudor England, along with several magnificent properties, Bletchingley, Richmond, and Hever Castle, once the home of Anne Boleyn. She was to be styled the king's beloved sister, ranked above every woman in the realm except the future Queen and Henry's two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. The settlement included jewels, fine plate, and rich clothing, a dowry of freedom, wealth, and dignity. To preserve his own pride, Henry publicly declared that Anne remained a virgin and was therefore free to remarry if she chose. The statement contradicted his earlier claims about her, yet none dared to point out the irony. For the first and perhaps only time in his life, the king behaved with something close to decency toward a woman he no longer wanted. On the 9th of July, 1540, the clergy of England formally pronounced the marriage null and void. Anne signed the decree before the king himself, her expression serene. The act was done quietly, bloodlessly, without bitterness. In a court where queens had been humiliated, imprisoned, and executed, Anne's composure turned defeat into triumph. Shortly afterward, she wrote to her brother, Duke William of Cleves, explaining what had happened. She assured him that she bore no anger toward the king, that she intended to remain in England, and that she found the country much to her liking. The estates and titles she had been granted would remain hers only if she stayed, and she saw no reason to leave. William's public reply was cautious. "I am glad that my sister has fared no worse," he said, but privately he was appalled by Henry's conduct. Anne, however, was content. In the months that followed, she began to enjoy her new life. She rode, hunted, and hosted small gatherings at her estates. She was often seen wearing the latest fashions from Flanders, her gowns bright and jewelled. Courtiers who visited her remarked that she seemed happier than she had ever been as queen. Henry himself, disarmed by her grace, grew genuinely fond of her company. He visited her often, sent gifts, and even spoke of her with affection. Thus, Anne of Cleves achieved what none of Henry's other wives had managed. She escaped his marriage bed and his temper, yet kept his friendship. She had lost a crown but gained her freedom and, in the strange alchemy of Tudor fortune, that made her the most fortunate of all the king's 6 wives. After the annulment, Anne of Cleves entered into a life of rare peace and privilege, a calm unlike anything she had known since arriving in England. Her income of £4,000 a year was paid regularly, enough to keep her household large, well-fed, and fashionable. She was granted her own palaces and estates, with servants, stables, and gardens that she could govern as she pleased. At Richmond and Bletchingley, her homes were filled with music and quiet laughter, free from the anxious formality of the royal court. Though no longer queen, she retained her dignity and her rank. Everyone at court addressed her as Lady Anne, the king's sister, a title that secured both her honour and her safety. Henry himself treated her with an unusual warmth. Perhaps he admired her composure, or perhaps he felt a rare flicker of guilt. Whatever the reason, he remained on good terms with her. Whenever great celebrations were held, feasts, weddings, or the christening of nobles' children, Anne received an invitation. When the king rode out for progress or pilgrimage, letters were often sent to her, full of courteous phrases. It was a strange friendship, born out of failure, but maintained by mutual respect. Henry, who had destroyed nearly every other woman who disappointed him, never again raised a hand or a word of anger against Anne. She, in turn, behaved with unerring tact. She never flaunted her independence or referred to her brief reign. When Henry remarried, she sent gifts and letters of congratulation. She called herself his humble and faithful sister, and she meant it, at least outwardly. Her household mirrored the dignity of a small royal court, organized, elegant, serene. In those years, Anne grew close to the king's two daughters. Princess Mary, quiet and grave, found in her an older woman who shared her seriousness of spirit. Princess Elizabeth, on the other hand, was bright and quick, full of curiosity. She had been barely 3 years old when her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed, and she had grown up half forgotten. To this clever, motherless child, Lady Anne offered affection and attention. Many times, young Elizabeth was allowed to visit Richmond to see Aunt Anne. The two would walk together through the gardens, reading psalms and learning languages. Anne spoke to her of kindness, patience, and faith, the virtues that had preserved her own life. Those visits left an impression. Later, Elizabeth would remember her Aunt Anne as the gentlest of women, calm, moderate, and wise. In the palace where affection had always been conditional, Anne's kindness had been unconditional. But while she tended her gardens and her peace, tragedy unfolded elsewhere. Thomas Cromwell, the man who had arranged her marriage, fell from power. Once the king's right hand, Cromwell had been made scapegoat for the failure of the Cleves Union. On the 28th of July, 1540, he was taken to Tower Hill. The crowd that gathered was large and restless. The executioner's first stroke missed, and the second was needed to end his life. That same day, Henry married Catherine Howard. The contrast was cruel. While Anne lived quietly, the man who had created her destiny died in agony. Henry claimed Cromwell's death as justice, a way to cleanse the realm and redeem the embarrassment of his German marriage. In truth, it was politics. Cromwell had grown too powerful, his reformist vision too ambitious for the king's liking. Anne watched the news unfold with her usual composure. Perhaps she felt a moment of sadness, perhaps relief. He had brought her to England, and for that she owed him her fate, both the misery and the strange freedom that followed. Anne's own life seemed blessed by contrast. She had escaped the gilded cage of Henry's marriage without losing her head, her fortune, or her dignity. The courtiers who had once whispered about her foreign manners now spoke of her intelligence and moderation. She received guests, hosted small hunts, and dressed in silks of deep blue and crimson. The king sent her gifts of furs, jewellery, and horses, a gesture of friendship, but also of pride, for it pleased him to be seen as generous toward the wife he had once rejected. In the tapestry of Tudor England, Anne's thread became a quiet, steady colour amid a field of blood and gold. She asked for nothing more than to be left in peace, and peace, against all odds, was granted to her. While Henry's court remained a theatre of jealousy, intrigue, and danger, Anne's homes became sanctuaries of calm. She read books in both German and English, dined early, and slept easily. No guards watched her doors. No whispers threatened her name. She was no longer a queen, but she was freer perhaps than any woman who had ever worn Henry's crown. Thus began the rarest of fates for a Tudor woman. A life without fear, a life reclaimed from the shadow of a king. In the year 1542, following the execution of Catherine Howard on the 13th of February, Duke William of Cleves once again sought to secure his sister's position. Believing that reconciliation would serve both diplomacy and the king's reputation, he suggested that Henry VIII remarry Anne. The proposal, he argued, would please both the people and the princes of Christendom. But Henry's answer was firm and final no. His vanity could not bear the idea of returning to the woman he had once publicly rejected. Anne herself felt no desire to resume the title of queen. She had tasted the peace of independence and had no wish to surrender it again to the volatile moods of her former husband. Yet in public she handled the situation with her usual intelligence. When rumours of William's proposal reached England, Anne sighed theatrically and said she was sorry to be refused by His Majesty once more. The performance delighted the courtiers, and Henry, flattered by the implication that she still longed for him, declared before the court that Lady Anne shall ever remain the most beloved sister of the king. It was an elegant truce, sealed not by passion but by pride. When Henry married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, In July of 1543, Anne's reaction was calm and faintly ironic. Upon hearing the news, she smiled and said, "Madame Parr hath taken a great burden upon herself." Those who heard her words understood the meaning. Anne had once been that burden, and she knew too well what it meant. The years passed quietly. Henry's health declined, his body swollen, his temper violent, his court restless with intrigue. When he died on the 28th of January, 1547, Anne's world changed again. The Council of Regency, ruling in the name of the 9-year-old Edward VI, stripped her of 2 of her residences, Bletchingley and Richmond properties that had been granted to her for life by the late king. Anne did not protest publicly. She withdrew instead to Hever Castle, once the home of Anne Boleyn, and settled into a life of modest solitude. From Hever, she sent occasional letters to London, often addressed to Thomas Cawarden, the master of the revels, who managed her accounts. In these letters, written in careful English, she complained politely of late payments and missing funds. Her tone was always courteous, never defiant. It was the same quiet persistence that had carried her through the dangers of Henry's reign, the patience of one who knew that anger never served the powerless. Under the rule of Queen Mary I, Anne returned briefly to public life. On the 4th of August, 1553, she wrote a warm letter congratulating Mary on her marriage to Philip of Spain. Later that same year, on the 28th of September, she appeared in London for Mary's coronation. Riding in a ceremonial litter behind the new queen, Anne was given a place of honour. The people cheered her, as she passed not as a foreigner, not as a discarded queen, but as a familiar figure of grace and endurance. It was the last public appearance she would ever make. England, under Mary, turned once more to the Catholic faith. For Anne, the change was neither difficult nor dangerous. Her father had been a Lutheran reformer, but her mother a devout Catholic. From both she had learned tolerance. To her, religion was less a battlefield than a bridge. When Mary invited her to attend Mass, Anne agreed without hesitation, explaining that she saw the return of Catholic worship as the natural way of my mother's faith. She was no zealot, and the Queen, who valued loyalty above doctrine, praised her for her reason and moderation. Still, the shadows of the past never completely faded. In the wake of Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, a Protestant uprising against Mary's marriage to Philip, suspicion briefly touched Anne. Some whispered that she had written to her brother William, asking him to intercede on behalf of Princess Elizabeth, who had been accused of sympathy with the rebels. Whether true or not, the rumour was enough. The Queen's advisers quietly recommended that Anne retire once more to her estates, and she obeyed without protest. Her health began to fail in the years that followed. By 1557, she was gravely ill, suffering from what modern historians believe may have been cancer. Queen Mary allowed her to move to Chelsea Old Manor, a comfortable residence near the Thames. There, surrounded by her servants and a few loyal friends, Anne prepared herself for death, as serenely as she had lived her life. She wrote her will with meticulous care, leaving gifts to each member of her household: money, jewels, fine gowns, and plate. She requested that the rents from her lands be used to settle her debts, and asked that one of her maids be accepted into the service of Princess Elizabeth. Her thoughts, even at the end, were gentle and practical. Anne of Cleves died on the 16th of July, 1557, at the age of 41. She was the last of Henry's 6 wives to die, and the only one to pass away peacefully in her bed. Queen Mary, moved by affection and respect, ordered that Anne be buried with full royal honours in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was grand, her coffin draped in cloth of gold, her service sung by the Abbey's finest voices. A magnificent tomb was planned for her, but it was never completed. Even into the reign of King James I, work continued only in part before funds were diverted elsewhere. For centuries, her resting place was marked simply by 2 initials, AC, until, in 1970, a small bronze plaque was added to commemorate her. Thus ended the life of Anne of Cleves, the quiet survivor, the wise woman among the king's 6 wives. She had outlived them all, not by chance, but by understanding the one truth that none of the others had grasped, that sometimes, in a court of power and peril, survival is the highest form of victory. After all the storms that had swept through her life, Anne of Cleves came to understand a simple truth in the Tudor court. Power was never safe, and affection never permanent. Kings could raise a woman to the throne one week and send her to the scaffold the next. The fate of queens was written in the shifting moods of a single man. But for Anne, the story unfolded differently. Henry could strip her of a crown, but not of her peace. He could dismiss her as wife, but not destroy her as a person. She had become, in the quietest way, untouchable. It was not love that protected her. It was something rarer. Henry did not love Anne, yet he could not bring himself to hate her. Where other wives had challenged, pleaded, or wept, Anne merely bowed her head and smiled. She never accused, never demanded, never clung to her lost title. Her calm baffled him. In her silence, he could find no mirror for his anger. It was as though she lived in a different kind of time, slower, gentler, beyond the reach of royal temper. In that smile, the king sensed both dignity and distance, the unspoken grace of someone who understood how fleeting favour could be. Anne had accepted the impermanence of power long before Henry had. Where he grasped and raged, she released, and because she released, she endured. Over the years that followed, their strange companionship continued. Henry often invited Anne to court on feast days and great occasions. At Christmas or Easter, she would ride from Richmond or Hever to attend Mass beside him. She was always punctual, always serene, dressed with modest splendour, her German gowns rich, but never ostentatious. She curtsied deeply, and the king greeted her with warmth, calling her sister. When he sent gifts, bolts of silk, fine furs, or silver plate, he accompanied them with friendly messages. "To my good sister, whom I hold in constant affection." The courtiers watched with astonishment. In a reign marked by betrayal and fear, here was something that looked like gentleness. Even the most cynical among them could not help but respect it. To see a woman once discarded, now treated as a trusted companion, seemed almost miraculous. Anne, who had entered England as a political token, had quietly become one of the few people in Henry's circle who posed no threat, who wanted nothing, who simply existed in peace. Those who knew her well said that her kindness was not weakness, but wisdom. She understood that in a world ruled by men's egos, compassion was a weapon stronger than defiance. She did not flatter Henry as others did, yet she never humiliated him. Her presence reminded him of his better self, or perhaps the self he wished to believe still existed. It was said that when he was ill or melancholy, he would sometimes speak of her with a sigh, calling her "that good lady who was ever gentle to me." For Anne, kindness was not an act but a way of survival. She had watched too many proud women fall. She had seen beauty become a curse, wit a danger, and ambition a death sentence. So she chose a different path, humility not as surrender, but as strength. It was her invisible armour, her way of moving safely through a court where affection could turn to accusation overnight. And perhaps, in her quiet way, Anne pitied the king. She had seen him at his most human, stripped of majesty, trapped in his own fury. The man who had mocked her appearance was now swollen with age and pain, haunted by the ghosts of wives and courtiers he had condemned. While others trembled before him, Anne alone could look at him without fear. For what could he take from her now? Their relationship, if it could be called that, became a strange balance of gratitude and restraint. Henry gave her gifts. She gave him peace. He found in her company a rare comfort, the absence of conflict. She, in turn, found safety in his favour and freedom in his forgetfulness. To the outside world, it was almost incomprehensible. How could the same king, who had sent 2 wives to death, still write letters of affection to one he had rejected? Yet there it was proof that even in the brutal logic of Tudor politics, grace could survive. Anne never used her position to seek advantage. She made no alliances, no secret correspondences. Her home was filled not with schemers or suitors, but with musicians, gardeners and priests. She gave generously to the poor around her estates and was remembered as a kind mistress who never raised her voice. In a court built on fear, Anne's gentleness became her legacy. She was neither saint nor strategist, simply a woman who had learned the power of stillness. Her life, once shaped by men's ambitions, had become her own. Even Henry, restless and suspicious to the end, seemed at peace in her presence. He who had loved and destroyed so many could not destroy her. Perhaps because, unlike all the others, she had never tried to possess him. She had only smiled, and in that small, steady kindness, she had won the one victory that mattered most. She had outlived his cruelty with grace. In Anne's quiet and carefully measured life, it was her bond with Elizabeth that shone brightest, a connection born not of blood, but of something gentler and more enduring. When Elizabeth was still a small, motherless child, she was often brought to visit Aunt Anne, the kind lady who lived at Richmond and later at Hever. Those visits, simple as they seemed, left a deep mark on both their lives. Anne treated the little girl with a tenderness that no one else at court seemed capable of giving. She never spoke of tragedy or politics. She offered only warmth. Together they would sit by the window, sewing small pieces of cloth or reading softly from the Psalms. Anne taught her the patience of needlework, the slow rhythm of creating beauty one careful stitch at a time. She showed her how to listen before speaking, how to bow with grace, how to smile without surrendering her dignity. These small lessons, quiet as breath, became the foundation of something far greater in the years to come. Elizabeth, sharp-eyed even as a child, absorbed everything. She had known fear before she could understand it. Her mother's name whispered as treason, her status shifting with every turn of her father's temper. In Anne's company, for the first time, she found steadiness. There was no judgment, no reminder of her lineage, no warning to be silent or invisible. Anne treated her not as a royal pawn, but as a child worthy of affection. When they read from Scripture, Anne would pause to explain the verses in her soft German-accented English, her voice low and musical. The words of peace, endurance, and faith must have seemed like spells to the little girl who had known only uncertainty. Years later, when Elizabeth became the woman who would rule England, those early memories lingered not as a grand influence, but as a quiet echo. Historians would never find written proof that Anne of Cleves shaped the future queen's mind. Yet the resemblance between them was unmistakable. Both women learned the same lesson, that survival in a world built for men depended on composure. Anne had survived Henry's rejection. Elizabeth would survive his legacy. Anne had taught her, without ever naming it, the art of restraint, the wisdom of waiting until the storm had passed before speaking, the strength in appearing calm when the heart was trembling. Elizabeth would master these same qualities, transforming them into the steel beneath her crown. Her patience during the reigns of Edward VI and Mary I, her unflinching stillness while she was imprisoned at the Tower, all of it bore traces of that early influence. It was an odd symmetry. The woman who had never borne a child had, in her quiet way, mothered a future queen. Anne's gentleness had taught Elizabeth that power need not roar to be felt. That one could command not through fear, but through calm. That silence, when chosen, could be the sharpest weapon of all. As Elizabeth grew older and the world around her became more treacherous, she never forgot the peace she had known in Anne's company. Among the ruthless lessons of the Tudor court betrayal, ambition, survival, it was Anne's soft, steadfast presence that stood apart. Where others had taught Elizabeth to scheme or flatter, Anne had taught her to endure. Even in adulthood, when Elizabeth's letters were filled with the formal language of politics, a trace of that early affection remained. In one surviving note, written after Anne's death, Elizabeth referred to her as the kindest lady that ever I knew. It was not the grand language of statecraft, but something simpler, the voice of a woman remembering the only true gentleness she had known in her childhood. They had been, in their different generations, two women forced to navigate the same perilous world. Both had been daughters of disappointment, one cast aside by a husband, the other forgotten by a father. Yet neither allowed bitterness to devour them. They endured, not through rebellion, but through quiet, immovable strength. Anne's influence on Elizabeth was not of doctrine or politics, but of spirit. She showed the young princess that grace could coexist with survival, that dignity could live even in exile. In a court that prized cunning and cruelty, Anne's patience was a rare and radical virtue. When Elizabeth finally became queen in 1558, she did so carrying not only the fire of her mother's will, but the composure of the woman who had once held her hand by the fireside and taught her to keep her peace. In that way, Anne of Cleves, the wife who was never truly a wife, the queen who never ruled, left her truest legacy in the heart of England's greatest monarch. In the stillness of their shared history, The bond between them remained not written in law or lineage, but in the small, quiet moments where kindness had passed from one woman to another. And in that unspoken inheritance, Anne's gentle wisdom lived on, long after her name had faded from the gilded halls of kings. In the year 1553, when Mary I ascended the throne, England turned once again to the old faith. The bells of Westminster rang for Mass, the Latin hymns returned, and the country that had wavered for 2 decades between reform and tradition bent once more to Rome. Many at court whispered that Anne of Cleves, once hailed as the Protestant Queen, would soon find herself in danger. Her father, Duke John of Cleves, had been an ardent supporter of Martin Luther, and Anne's name had long been tied to the Protestant alliance that had once served Henry's politics. But Anne, as always, understood the deeper current beneath the storm. She did not protest or resist. Instead, she rose early one morning, dressed simply, and went to the royal chapel. There, before the altar, she knelt and recited the familiar Latin prayers of her childhood, words she had not spoken in public for many years. In that quiet act, she returned to the old rites, not out of fear or calculation, but out of peace. To her, religion was not a weapon or a banner. It was a rhythm of the soul, something too sacred to be twisted by politics. When she asked to be received once more into the Catholic Church, it caused a murmur among courtiers. Some thought it was submission, others prudence. But for Anne, it was neither. It was simply a gesture of harmony, a way to live without conflict in a world that thrived on division. She attended Mass in Latin, crossed herself with calm precision, and let the incense rise like a quiet bridge between her mother's faith and her father's conscience. There was no fear in her eyes. She had known fear once, years ago, when the sound of armoured feet in the dark might have meant death, but not now. The years had stripped her of illusions and ambition alike. She no longer cared for titles, creeds, or power. She cared only for peace. To many, her gentleness looked like weakness. Some sneered that Anne of Cleves bent whichever way the wind blew, that she had no faith of her own. But those who had lived long enough to understand the weight of survival saw her differently. They saw a woman who had endured the storms of Henry's temper, the fall of Cromwell, the suspicion of kings and councils, and had remained untouched. The strength to yield, they realized, is often the rarest kind of strength. Queen Mary I saw it too. Perhaps remembering her own mother, Catherine of Aragon, another foreign woman who had suffered in the name of faith, Mary treated Anne with tenderness. She permitted her to remain at her estates, free from scrutiny or suspicion. When Anne appeared at the coronation procession on the 28th of September, 1553, the Queen placed her in a seat of honour, carried in a litter behind her own. It was a public gesture, a reminder that mercy could still exist amid the ashes of vengeance. Anne, dressed in rich but modest velvet, bowed her head as the crowds cheered. She was no longer a queen, no longer even young, but she was at peace. She had outlived the man who had humiliated her, and the world no longer demanded that she prove herself. As the reign went on, the court became a maze of intrigue. Whispers of rebellion filled the air. In January of 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rising against Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain. The revolt was crushed, but suspicion lingered like a fog over the palace. Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister, was accused of sympathy with the rebels. Once again the Tower of London filled with fear and silence. Anne, who loved both women in different ways, found herself between loyalty and affection. But she chose neither side. She spoke no word of defence, no word of accusation. She wrote no letter, made no appeal. She kept to her household, praying quietly for peace. Her silence was not indifference, it was protection. To speak would have been to endanger both herself and the memory of a bond she treasured. Mary, uncertain whom she could trust, never doubted Anne. Perhaps she saw in her not a schemer, but a mirror, a woman who had learned that survival sometimes means saying nothing at all. While others were exiled, imprisoned, or executed, Anne remained untouched. She was neither praised nor blamed, and that suited her perfectly. In her stillness, she embodied something that England had nearly forgotten: grace without ambition, faith without fanaticism. She neither fought nor fled. She simply endured, her life like the slow movement of a psalm, soft, steady, and unbroken. By then, her hair had turned silver, and her hands, once so deft with the needle, had grown thin. Yet those who visited her at Chelsea later remembered how serene she seemed, her voice still low and measured, her laughter faint but warm. She never spoke of the past, not of Henry, nor of the court, nor of the throne that had once been hers. What remained of her was not bitterness, but a quiet wisdom. Anne of Cleves had discovered, at last, the only kind of victory that lasts. Not the victory of power, but the victory of peace. By the summer of 1557, Anne of Cleves' health began to fail. The once bright eyes that had watched so many storms now grew dim, and her steps, once light in the halls of Richmond, slowed to a gentle shuffle. Physicians advised rest, and Queen Mary, always fond of her, arranged for her to move to Chelsea Old Manor, a quiet house overlooking the Thames. There, far from the noise and fever of court, Anne found the stillness she had always sought. Chelsea was peaceful, a place of gardens, slow rivers, and soft English light. Each morning Anne would sit by the wide window in her chamber, wrapped in a shawl of pale wool, watching the river reflect the shifting sky. Sometimes it was silver, sometimes grey, sometimes gold. She wrote small notes in her diary, her handwriting neat and careful despite the tremor in her hands. There were no laments, no bitterness, only calm gratitude for a life that had, against all odds, been gentle in its ending. "God has been good," she is said to have written once. "He gave me storms so that I might value the quiet." As her body weakened, her mind remained clear. She spent her final months putting her affairs in order, with the same precision that had guided her through every trial. She dictated her will, ensuring that every servant, maid, and attendant received something. To one, a gold chain. To another, a ring or a piece of lace. To the old gardener at Hever, a small purse of coins. Even in death, she thought of fairness, of kindness, of leaving no heart empty-handed. She left detailed instructions that the rents from her estates be used to pay off her debts. "Let nothing be owed," she said, "for peace should not be burdened by unpaid promises." And in one final act of quiet affection, she asked that one of her closest maids, a girl who had served her since the early years of Edward VI's reign, be given a place in the household of Princess Elizabeth. It was her last way of sending a piece of herself to the young woman she had once loved, like a daughter. By July, the end was near. The servants moved softly through the house, speaking in whispers. Candles were kept burning in her chamber, though she no longer needed light to write. Each evening she asked to hear the psalms read aloud, the same verses she had once shared with Elizabeth, the same melodies she had hummed as a girl in Cleves. On the morning of the 16th of July, 1557, the maid who attended her entered her room and found her still. Anne had died in her sleep some time before dawn. There was no struggle, no cry, no sign of fear. Her hands were folded neatly upon the coverlet, her face serene. Those who stood by her bed said that she looked as though she were listening, as if, in her final dream, she had heard a familiar voice calling her home. News of her death spread quietly. Queen Mary ordered that she be buried with the full honours due to her rank. The funeral procession moved slowly through London to Westminster Abbey, the resting place of kings and queens. Her coffin, covered in cloth of gold, was borne on a chariot draped in black velvet, followed by nobles, clergy, and servants dressed in mourning. Bells tolled softly over the city. The ceremony was solemn and beautiful, held according to the old Catholic rites. The choir sang the Miserere, their voices echoing through the vaulted arches of the abbey. Candles flickered over the carved stone walls as the coffin was lowered into its place. For a moment, even the restless court of Tudor England seemed still. Mary herself did not attend, but sent her personal chaplains and a wreath of white roses. "She was ever gentle and true," the Queen said. "Let her be honoured as such. I'm still..." A grand tomb was planned for Anne, though, like so many Tudor promises, it remained unfinished. Funds ran short, and by the time of King James I, the work had stopped entirely. For centuries, her resting place was marked only by two small initials, A.C., carved into the stone near the south aisle of the abbey. Not until 1970 was a small bronze plaque added, bearing her full name and the words, Queen of England, 1540, but perhaps Anne of Cleves would not have minded. She had never cared for monuments or titles. Her life had been a quiet defiance of grandeur, a reminder that dignity could exist without power, that peace could be greater than glory. Those who spoke of her afterward did so softly. "If there is a heaven for those who endure," one court chronicler wrote, "then surely she rests there." And so she passed, the fourth wife, the foreign queen, the sister of the king, the only one of Henry's wives to die in peace, to be mourned without fear, and to be remembered not for tragedy or ambition, but for grace. In her stillness, she had triumphed over an age of violence. In her gentleness, she had found eternity. Anne of Cleves was never a powerful queen, nor a tragic lover like Anne Boleyn. She did not bear children to secure her place in history, nor did she ignite the passions that reshaped England's faith and crown. She came quietly and departed quietly, leaving no heirs, no scandals, no revolutions in her wake. Yet, in that stillness lay her quiet miracle. She survived. When every other woman who had stood beside Henry VIII met a fate of blood or sorrow, Anne alone walked away, unbroken. Catherine of Aragon had died in exile, abandoned. Anne Boleyn had fallen beneath the axe on Tower Green. Jane Seymour had perished, giving the king the son he longed for. Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, had followed her cousin to the scaffold. And Catherine Parr, the last of them, would die soon after the king, weary and widowed. Among that litany of tragedy, Anne of Cleves alone found peace. She lived out her days not as a queen, but as a free woman content, wealthy, and strangely beloved. Her grave in Westminster Abbey reflects the quiet truth of her life. There is no grand monument, no towering marble effigy, no Latin inscription carved in boastful flourish. Only 2 letters, AC, etched into stone. 2 small marks for a woman who had once been at the heart of one of the greatest courts in Europe. And yet, those letters are enough. They hold within them the story of a woman who endured where others perished, who understood that survival could be the purest form of triumph. It was not until the year 1970 that a small bronze plaque was finally placed above her resting place, bearing her full name and title, Anne of Cleves, Queen of England 1540. More than 4 centuries had passed since her death, and only then did England formally remember her. But perhaps she would have smiled at the delay. Recognition, after all, had never been her ambition. Anne had lived her entire life in the shadow of kings, first her father, then her husband. Yet she had managed to carve out a life that belonged to herself alone. She had navigated a world that offered women little but danger, and she had done so without deceit, without rebellion, without cruelty. Her weapons were patience, humility, and grace, qualities that the world too often mistook for weakness. But those same qualities had saved her when beauty, wit, and defiance had doomed others. She was not born to change the course of nations, yet she changed the meaning of what it was to endure. In an age when women were treated as pawns of alliance and vanity, Anne quietly redefined victory. Hers was not the victory of conquest, but of self-preservation. Not the fire of passion, but the calm of wisdom. She had no crown, but she had freedom. She held no power, yet she possessed peace. And in the ruthless theatre of Tudor England, that was the rarest crown of all. Even centuries later, her story feels like a sigh between storms, a moment of stillness in an age of chaos. The English remembered her not for her beauty or her lineage, but for her goodness. The servants who had lived with her spoke of her gentleness, her fairness, her laughter that was never cruel. She never forgot their names, and she never let bitterness touch her speech. She was ever kind and true, wrote one chronicler, and no lady in England was more beloved. In the grand tapestry of Henry's reign, Anne's thread is pale, almost invisible at first glance. Yet without it, the whole design would feel harsher, darker, emptier. She was the calm after the storm, the quiet reminder that gentleness could survive even in the court of a tyrant. Her life teaches something that no conquest or coronation could, that dignity is not found in glory, but in grace. That strength is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stay kind in a cruel world. That silence, when born of wisdom, can outlast the loudest voices of power. When we speak her name now, it is not with pity, but with a kind of reverence for the woman who understood what it meant to endure without hardening her heart. In a kingdom ruled by a man who could take everything, Anne of Cleves found a way to keep the one thing he could never claim, her peace. And so, When we tell her story, the lesson that lingers is not of a failed marriage or a king's fleeting fancy. It is the gentle truth she left behind, that patience is not passivity, that self-respect is its own kind of power, and that sometimes the quietest soul can teach the loudest age what true strength looks like. In the end, Anne of Cleves, the woman who did nothing, achieved what none of Henry's other wives ever could. She survived him, and in doing so she won the only victory that mattered.